Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to speak today on Bill C6, though as always, I look forward to the day that we can all be back in the chamber instead of speaking to pinhole cameras. Though I'm mindful that any inconveniences or challenges we face at MPs pale in significance to the impact of COVID on ordinary Canadians, those who have lost loved ones, lost livelihoods, or those who are still working on the front lines in this pandemic. And these impacts have been even more strong on the most marginalized among us, and especially the community I come from. I speak today as the NDP spokesperson on sexual orientation and gender identity and expression, or SOGI for short. But I also speak as an out gay man, someone who's been out in public life for nearly 3 decades. I wish today that we had a more representative parliament when it comes to topics affecting my community, like conversion therapy. Unfortunately, many of those voices we should be hearing from are absent. In this House, we have only 4 out gay MPs, no out lesbians, and no transgender or non-binary MPs. We're short about 30 MPs from my community. Some jurisdictions have done better. In fact, New Zealand just elected what has been described as the gayest parliament in the world, 10%. While it is great to celebrate this as a milestone, I might suggest a more accurate headline that goes something like this. New Zealand finally elects a parliament that nears fair representation of the SOGI community. Then the story would have to go on to say that the total doesn't include any trans or non-binary MPs, despite New Zealand having elected the first trans MP in the world, Georgina Beyer, who served from 1999 to 2007. I also want to give a quick shout out today to British Columbia, which has just re-elected 6 SOGI MLAs. It looks like the number will still be 6 when the dust settles, but that's about 7% of the legislature again, and tying the UK, which is compared to only a mere 1% of this House. That's a hint to both SOGI individuals and parties when it comes to nominations for the next election. And as someone who has always been recruiting as the gay stereotype goes, I know this remains a challenge. So why the long preamble on representation? Well, I firmly believe that the most diverse parliaments make the best legislation. It's not only that diverse parliaments are likely to have more MPs with lived experience on the topics at hand, though that's true, but perhaps more importantly, they will have the networks in the communities they represent and in Canada as a whole to bring those diverse experiences and voices to bear on the matters at hand. Besides, it's also important to remember, as one wag once said, if you're not at the table, you are much more likely to be on the menu. Clearly, this Parliament, we have more work to do to make sure that diverse voices are heard on the topic of conversion therapy. When it comes to Bill C6, which seeks to end the practice of conversion therapy in Canada, I want to start by saying 3 things, at least 2 of which should be obvious to all, but clearly are not. The first is that no one in the SOGI community needs to be fixed because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. The prevalence of homophobia and transphobia makes it hard enough for many of us to live our authentic lives as who we are at home, at work, and everywhere else in our daily lives. The very idea that we can or need to be fixed, that is fundamental to the concept of conversion therapy, only serves to reinforce that homophobia and transphobia. The idea that one's sexual orientation or gender identity could possibly be changed is especially problematic for those who early in their lives are still working their way toward figuring out exactly who they are. For queer youth, the idea that they need to be fixed can and does contribute both to self-hate and to fear of rejection by family and friends, both very damaging to mental health. The second thing that should be obvious, and I think is to most people, is that certain sexual orientations and gender identities and expressions are not better than others. And it is certainly not appropriate for governments to prefer some sexual orientations and gender identities over others. Nor is it appropriate to disadvantage or fail to protect some of our citizens because of their gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation. All of us are equally deserving of equal protection under the law, and that is the essence of the issues raised in Bill C6. Finally, the third thing I want to raise at the outset of this debate is apparently less well understood, though it is a clearly established fact. It is impossible to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity, and as a result, conversion therapy is harmful to those who are subjected to it. As for the outcomes of these practices, whether they're called conversion therapy or reparative therapy or aversion therapy or gender-affirming therapy, those names don't really matter. The results are always the same. There is no change, and those who are subjected to it suffer from outcomes including guilt and shame, depression, social isolation, and often self-harm or even death by suicide. Fortunately, I myself was never subjected to conversion therapy, though some in my own family were anything but accepting. But I recognize now, ironically, that attempts to beat the gay out of me may have been actually less harmful in the long run than being subjected to conversion therapy. That's because the overt violence allowed me to focus the resulting anger and hostility outward rather than inward on myself. It's frankly hard to imagine that some of the torture that was carried out in the past under the name of therapy actually ever took place. Far too many Canadians were subjected to barbaric practices like electroshock therapy, chemical castration, and even exorcism, as we heard today. Yet, frankly, it's equally hard for me to accept the idea that conversion therapy should still be going on in Canada to this day. No less harmful in its results, even if somewhat less brutal sometimes in its means. The fact that conversion therapy is harmful to those subjected to it is the reason this pernicious practice has been condemned internationally and domestically by health professionals. More than 8 years ago, on May 17th, 2012, on the 22nd anniversary of the removal of homosexuality from the list of recognized mental disorders, the World Health Organization issued a statement labeling conversion therapy to be, and I quote, a serious threat to the health and well-being, even the lives of affected people. 8 years ago, the World Health Organization called for action at the national level to ban and place sanctions on conversion therapy. No organization of health professionals in Canada currently approves of or allows the practice of conversion therapy. No provincial health plans allow for the practice of conversion therapy as part of the public health care system. So conversion therapy is no longer supposed to be taking place within the formal healthcare system in this country. Yet we know that it still goes on in the shadows. And not only is it taking place in Canada, but some Canadians are still being sent for conversion therapy in the United States. A report on conversion therapy in Canada was published in February of this year, which surveyed over 7,200 gay, bisexual, and two-spirit men. More than 20% reported being subjected to some form of conversion therapy. And when it comes to transgender and non-binary Canadians, the numbers approach 50%. So it's one thing to know from formal studies that this is still taking place, but it's quite another to hear the brave survivors who have come forward to tell their stories of the harm they suffered as a result. I encourage all MPs to listen carefully to those stories. When it comes to Bill C6, let me say again, as we did last March and when the bill was reintroduced recently, New Democrats will be supporting C6 at second reading. What the bill does can briefly be summarized as follows. It specifically criminalizes subjecting minors to conversion therapy and transporting minors out of Canada for the purpose of conversion therapy. It criminalizes subjecting adults to conversion therapy against their will, and it criminalizes what we call the business of conversion therapy. The main strength of Bill C6 is its focus on youth. For its young people, that conversion therapy is almost always directed against, and it is young people who suffer the greatest harm from those attempts to force them to be someone that they are not. A second strength is the suite of comprehensive measures to ban the practice or promotion of the business of conversion therapy, which would help ensure the practice is actually shut down by making it illegal to charge for, to profit from, or to advertise conversion therapy for both minors and adults. The bill contains significant power to seek court orders to remove offending materials from online platforms. Now let me stop for a moment here to address the reddest of red herrings concerning this bill. And this is the, quote, what about argument that goes, what about the rights of others? And in particular, what about the rights of others whose religious freedoms might be infringed by this bill? For me, it's always a red flag when I hear arguments that start with, what about? The resort to whataboutism is rarely about promoting real dialogue, but instead is usually a diversionary tactic to take the argument onto grounds that the whatabouters think will make it easier for them to win the argument. What I'm saying is that arguments that start with what about are most often exercises in distraction, rather than attempting to confront the real issues before us. Section 5 of C6 says clearly that the definition of conversion therapy in the bill does not refer to, and I quote, a person's exploration of their identity or its development. This means that there is nothing in the bill that prevents parents from talking to their children about their sexual orientation or gender identity. Nothing in this bill prevents spiritual leaders from discussing these topics with their followers. Nothing in this bill prohibits anyone from holding bigoted and outdated ideas about sexual orientation or gender identity or expression. What it does prevent is taking those beliefs and ideas and turning them into hateful and harmful practices disguised as therapy. How this bill is an appropriate bill for a free vote is a question that I will continue to have for my conservative colleagues. Now, returning to the NDP position on this bill, again, as I've said, we'll support it at second reading, but we do believe the bill can and should be improved. So what are those improvements we're looking for? First, we would like to see the government respond positively to the demand from the SOGI community for a full ban on conversion therapy, a ban for adults as well as for children. The minister has made the argument previously that his goal here is to have a bill that is charter challenge proof. His solution has been to design C6 to avoid possible charter challenges by focusing on non-consenting adults, minors, and the business of conversion therapy. It sets aside the question of so-called consenting adults. This is a good argument in that I do believe this particular bill would survive a charter challenge, and the provisions around the business of conversion therapy included will result in an effective ban on the practice for consenting adults, at least when it comes to paid services. However, I also believe that a total ban would survive a charter challenge, and I would very much like to see any legal opinions that the government might have saying that it would not. In brief, my argument here is that there's an equally compelling charter argument that it's a reasonable limit on fundamental rights to prohibit anyone from giving consent to a practice that is clearly harmful to those subjected to it. And without going too far down the legal rabbit hole here, there is parallel jurisprudence which has upheld restrictions on things like fight clubs that lead me to conclude that a full ban would also be found charter compliant. The second and perhaps more significant area in which the bill can be improved is in the language used to define what conversion therapy is. The language in C6 is actually pretty good when it comes to the traditional conversion therapy practice directed at sexual orientation. I'm also glad that there is language in the bill attempting to ensure that it covers banning conversion therapy directed at trans and non-binary Canadians. This kind of practice is often styled as gender-affirming therapy or transition treatment or other such positive-sounding names. But I would have to say that this is where the language in the bill is not so good. And in committee, we will need to have a close look at this section of the bill to make sure it is as comprehensive and up-to-date with current practice as possible when it comes to so-called therapies aimed at transgender and non-binary Canadians. Now let me address a bit of revisionist history that has crept into the discussion of this bill. I want to take a moment to remind the House how we got here to second reading on a bill to ban conversion therapy. Of course, elected officials have played a role, but not everybody who's on side now was always there. Former Saskatoon West NDP MP Sherry Benson, the only out lesbian in the previous parliament, sponsored petition 1833 in that last parliament, which called on the government to ban conversion therapy. That petition received nearly 20,000 signatures. And when the petition was presented to the government in March of 2019, the Liberal government said they would take no action as they argued conversion therapy was a provincial responsibility. In his 2019 Pride message, the NDP leader, the member for Burnaby South, called for a ban as part of the NDP platform. The Liberals still refused to budge. Then on September 29th, in the midst of the election campaign just over a year ago, the Prime Minister suddenly changed course and promised a federal ban on conversion therapy. His December 2019 mandate letter for the Justice Minister included instructions to bring forward legislation to ban conversion therapy. And I do thank the Minister for doing so, and I welcome this conversion. But I have no doubt also in the sincerity of his intentions to get a bill through this Parliament which will end this practice. But let me stress today, as always, no progress on SOGI rights has ever taken place that hasn't been fought for by courageous members of our community. And no place has that role been more important than in the case of brave conversion therapy survivors who have stepped up to tell their stories. Without them, the rest of us might have gone on blithely assuming that formal professional condemnation of conversion therapy was enough and had actually stopped this practice. I can't name all of those who've spoken up, but let me quickly point to two who've helped deepen my understanding of how harmful this practice can be and how it continues to go on. Thank you to Erica Muse and Matt Ashcroft for speaking boldly and publicly. Madam Speaker, there are days when the younger me is still surprised that I can stand in the House of Commons and speak as an openly gay man, and even more surprised that I do so as an official party spokesperson on sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. Yet there are also days when I'm discouraged about the long distance we still have to go to reach full equality and acceptance, especially for transgender and non-binary Canadians. And there are also days when I'm hopeful that we will soon see more MPs from my community, including trans and non-binary representatives. As I said, we need those diverse voices here in the House, and young Canadians need to see those role models. In conclusion, let me say, Madam Speaker, it is time to act, and in fact, long past time to bring an end to this harmful practice. Yet as welcome as new laws banning the practice are, new laws alone will not be sufficient to repair the past damage from conversion therapy, nor to combat the hate that underlies these practices. The government will need to fund capacity building within the SOGI community so that these challenges can be addressed by our community ourselves. And unfortunately, for some from our community, it is far too late, and they will never be able to be brought back with us. I look forward to speedy passage of this bill so that we can get on with the important work of healing. I look forward to the day when we can say that all forms of conversion therapy have been banned from Canada and are no longer practiced. And I look forward to the day that we can fully celebrate the full range of sexual and gender diversity in our country. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Spadina, Fort York.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for a very strong and very principled speech. I would expect nothing less from him on this topic. In fact, on virtually every topic he stands on. He challenges us in his comments, and I'm not going to ask a question about his comments. I think they stand for themselves and are well reasoned. My question for him is simply this. Those of us who want to see the day that he speaks of realized have work to do with him. And I'd like to know from his perspective what the next steps Parliament, in fact Canada, needs to take to realize that vision and that dream of his of full equality, and what he challenges us as parliamentarians to take up in battle with them to make sure that all members of his community enjoy the full rights that he speaks to.
The Honourable Member for Esquimalt, Saanich, Sooke.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. I know we don't have time enough in response to really answer that question. It's one of the reasons I focused on representation in my speech today. I do look forward to the day when we have a more representative House on all grounds, including sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. I would have to say that conversion therapy is an urgent matter because these harms are taking place regularly, unfortunately, within our society. So I'd like us to see this bill pass expeditiously, and I'd like to see it enforced by the end of the year if we can possibly manage that. Thank you.
Some comments. The Honourable Member for Parry Sound, Muskoka.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for his advocacy, his bravery, and for his words today. I really do appreciate it. I wanted to really just give the member an opportunity to speak a little bit more about his comments related to a charter challenge and ensuring that this important legislation banning something that is truly heinous and wrong does not get in fact challenged in the courts over the charter. And I felt like he had to speak too quickly about it, and I wanted to give him an opportunity to speak a little bit more about the importance of protecting this from a charter challenge.
Member for Esquimalt, Saanich, Sooke.
Well, I thank the honourable member for that question. Unfortunately, I believe that no matter what we do, this bill will be challenged in court because of the prevalence of homophobia and transphobia. So, yes, I agree. It's important we write the best bill that we can. But we can't write a bill that deals with the questions of whataboutism that I referred to This bill is about ending a harmful practice directed at members of my community. And to put it in the most simple terms, the Charter is subject to reasonable limits. And one of those reasonable limits is that others' rights stop at the harm that is done to me. And so I believe that this bill will ultimately survive any Charter challenge. Thank you.
Questions and